Hi everyone! In this time-lapse video, I'm going to share how I created this Calico Cat portrait using pastel pencils. I'll talk you through how I approached each area, the decisions I made in regards to layering the colours, and how I kept the fur looking soft and clean without muddying those colours. Now, just using pastel pencils worked really well for this portrait because they gave me good control over where each colour transitioned. I usually always start with the eyes in my drawings, as they set the whole feel of the portrait. And I began by sketching in the shape with just a black Carbothello pencil. I used light pressure because I didn't want heavy outlines. I just wanted enough just to place the main curves and hint at those darker shadows. Now, once the pupil was plotted in, I focused on the highlight. Now, I will never usually jump straight to white. I like to put down either a cold grey first or some blues, like a bit of ultramarine blue, and I feel that this just adds depth and makes the reflection look more realistic. Once I'm happy with that reflection, I'll use a pigmented pencil, something like the General's chalk white pencil, right at the end just to pop in the brightest spot of that reflection before I move on to the iris. Now, for the iris itself, I laid down a base of an orange yellow and I deepened the shaded areas with my black before mixing in touches of burnt umber and a bit of olive green just to build that contrast in the eyes. Now, when starting the fur, I do like to start by blocking in my midtones first. And by building up those midtones lightly, I left enough texture in the paper so that when I was ready to deepen my shadows and add the highlights, the new layers sat well and they didn't sort of slide or look overworked. Now, drawing this type of fur can be quite a challenge because the colour shifts so quickly from light to dark and back again. And if you rush those layers, all of those pretty colours can end up blending too much and losing their vibrancy. Now, one thing I always keep in mind is that when I'm moving from a very dark area like black straight into a light area, I need to use a transition colour in between. Now, what this does is it softens that jump in colour and stops the fur from turning muddy or giving it an unnatural look. Now, for the transition areas, I used the burnt sienna or some of my browns. And I tried to make sure that I blended each area softly so the transition from light to dark fur looked more natural and not blocky. A clean cotton bud or your finger works really well here, whichever one gives you more control. I also always keep a tissue or a cloth handy just to wipe my pencil tip between colours. It's such a simple habit, but it really helps to keep your colours from mixing when they shouldn't. Now, onto the nose, I used a combination of cinnamon and burnt sienna just to build up the shape and the warmth. And inside the nostrils, I tapped in just a little bit of chocolate brown just to add a little bit of depth. Now, I usually always blend lightly with my Q-tip so that the edges stay soft. And for the soft pinker tones, I used a light flesh tint. Once I was happy with the nose shading, I just slightly glazed a bit of white over the top just to catch the light without making it look too stark. Now, across the bridge of the nose and over the cheeks, I blended those layers of cinnamon, brown ochre, and just a touch of cold grey just to shape the subtle shadows. Now, I check the flow of the fur often on my portraits. I always take a step back now and then just to make sure that the markings are sitting right from a distance. For the ears, I kept them slightly less detailed than the eyes so that they didn't pull away the focus. I built them up with layers of cinnamon, brown ochre and ivory for the inner ear. Along the edges, a few flick outs with the black. Just give that hint at those soft hairs. And I blended them lightly so they didn't look too harsh. On the cheeks and the jawline, I blocked in brown ochre and some light ochre, first to map out the Calico's distinctive patches. And for the deeper shadows, I used bistre and some small touches of the black, just adding these darker strokes slowly and blending just helped keep the fur looking soft. Now when I blend, I do swap between a clean cotton bud and my fingertip. I'm especially careful not to drag dark pigment into my lighter areas. And following the direction of the fur with each stroke when you're blending just makes a big difference in keeping your portrait look realistic. Now, I do not usually use pure white as my underpainting unless the subject calls for it. But for the areas around the nose and around the mouth, I did lay down a base of white first. And this just helps preserve those brightest highlights and keeps the fur looking nice and clean. And even after more shading goes on top, it still maintains that vibrancy. Now I did add some soft shadows with cold and warm greys, just shaping the small ridges and those little whisker pads. Now tiny dots and delicate lines just hint at the short hairs here, but I wanted to keep them subtle so they didn't distract from the eyes and the nose. Now for the chin, I used a French grey and a warm grey for the base. And I shaded one side just slightly darker just to match the light source direction. On top, I just layered a few short, fine white strokes using a very sharp pencil. And I was keeping my pressure light, which stops the hairs from looking too heavy. When I went on to the neck and the chest, I worked in bigger clumps. I used my warm greys, light ochres, and plenty of the clean whites, just to show the fluffiness. I wanted to avoid blending it perfectly smooth because I wanted to leave a bit of that pencil texture just to suggest that looser, lighter fur that you can see on the cat's chest. I glazed the first layers using the side of my pencil just to cover those larger areas quickly, and then I come back in with a sharper point just to flick in those finer hairs that overlap and break up any blocks of colour. Now, if I find an area looking too flat or dull, I'll just freshen it up with a few bright white flicks right at the end, and I'll usually use that General's chalk pencil for that. Now, adding the whiskers is always my final touch. I make sure that my white pencil is sharp, and I flick each whisker in a single confident motion. I vary the length and curve them slightly so that they do look natural. Now don't worry if one ends up looking too thick or wobbly when you're doing your whiskers. You can always soften it gently with a cotton bud or add a little bit of that fur colour back over just to fix that line. And before I wrap up a portrait, I always revisit the eyes and the nose. I like to come in with either the Cretacolor black or a dark charcoal pencil, just to deepen up those pupils and nostrils so that they stand out really clearly. I'll then check the little reflections and tidy up any edges if needed. I always look at the whole portrait one last time so that I can darken or lighten any parts that might just need that extra little bit of contrast. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and a thumbs up. It'll really help me grow my channel. And if you'd like to see more tutorials like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to draw along with me in real time with step-by-step guidance, the full tutorial is available inside my Whiskers to Wildlife Academy, and I'll leave a link for that below this video, so feel free to check that out. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.